the things that's wonderful or can be wonderful about anger is that it helps us to acknowledge a wound and to begin to address the problem at the root of that wound, or to begin to kind of heal or scrub clean or otherwise cauterize that wound. Welcome back to the Stand Firm Project. My name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph. I teach at the Dominican House of Studies, and I work as an assistant director for the Thomistic Institute. And I thought we could talk a little bit about anger. Anger is confusing or bewildering because when we experience it, when we feel it, we often don't know what to do with it because it comes in hot, because it comes in strong. Now, mind you, we have examples in the tradition of our Lord in anger, of saints in anger. And so we know that it's possible not only to salvage, but in fact to save. And yet when we experience it in our own humanity, it's often mixed with just a lot of other things, which can be difficult for us to sort through. So I thought we could just spend some time thinking about what anger is, and then how we go about healing and growing anger so that it attains to the term for which it's intended. So anger is what we might call an emotion, or which others in the tradition call a passion. So that's to say that it's a bodily movement which has a kind of resonance throughout our whole human life. All right, so what are other examples of emotions or of passions? You can think simply about love, like a kind of recognition of something is good for you, or desire, a movement to that good thing, or delight, a kind of rest in that good thing. Now, on the other hand, you can think about those types of passions or emotions which are in response to something evil. So we'd call that response to something hateful as hatred. I gave it away there, my bad. Hatred is the kind of response that we have before something that's not fitting for us as human beings. And then when we try to avoid it, we call that aversion. But when it visits itself upon us, we'd call that sorrow. Those are all kind of simple movements of the emotions or of the passions. But as we know, there are other passions which arise which are more complicated because we recognize some difficulty in the situation, something that maybe tempts us or taunts us or threatens us or otherwise complicates us. And so you can think about hope, or you can think about fear, you can think about despair, you can think about daring, kind of audacity. And it's in this conversation where anger arises. Anger is a recognition of a kind of injustice. Something has been done to me that ought not to have been done. And when St. Thomas Aquinas talks about it, he'll say that it's usually by way of slight. Another way of describing it might be to say that, somebody ought to have held me in mind or heart, and they failed to do so, or they acted deliberately against that in such a way that I register it as an offense, something that, again, ought not to have been done, but was done. And then anger kind of issues in this desire for vindication. Now, mind you, vindication isn't necessarily revenge in the way that, you go out kind of meting out justice regardless of whether or not you're the person to do it because it feels good and you need to sate your desire. No, we're talking about just the rectification of justice. So when unjust things happen, we ought to make them just insofar as we can, and insofar as it's our responsibility to do so. So anger, just kind of taken at face value, is a good thing insofar as it's part of our human experience, it's part of our human nature, and God created us good. When you think about it in kind of more elevated moral terms, it's kind of a neutral thing insofar as it's just what we find, it's just what we experience. What makes it good or bad is whether or not it's incorporated into a human culture and a genuinely human pursuit. So obviously, the language of virtue and vice is familiar to you, so it doesn't come by way of surprise. But we call those angry movements of the body, those angry movements of the heart, we call them virtuous when they are incorporated into a virtuous life, and we call them vicious when they kind of slump into or lapse into a vicious life. So when we kind of give way to our anger without thinking through it, without sorting through it, without making judgments and then actions on the basis of what's good and how we ought to respond to it, then that's where we fall into the vice of wrath. you've probably come across these 7 deadly sins or these 7 capital vices. So we start with like pride, envy, we arrive at anger or wrath, and then you kind of proceed by way of sloth or sloth, depending on how you pronounce it. I never know. Avarice, gluttony, and lust. And what's so dehumanizing or what's so destructive about wrath is that it kind of clogs us up as human beings where we can't actually think through or work through anything because we're just so bound up by our anger. We're so conflicted by it that it consumes us. It utterly consumes us. And we can only think and act in terms of our anger. And then you find yourself lapsing into wrath or revenge or other crass human things. So what we want to do is we want to heal anger and grow anger so that it serves a purpose. Now you might think to yourself, what purpose could it possibly serve? Again, we can appeal to those figures in the tradition who give us assurance that anger can play some good role or some positive role in human life, like our Lord when he cleanses the temple, for instance. And I think that just consulting our experience, one of the things that's wonderful or can be wonderful about anger is that it helps us to acknowledge a wound and to begin to address the problem at the root of that wound, or to begin to kind of heal or scrub clean or otherwise cauterize that wound. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a kind of innocence to anger. Now, when you sit with your anger and you brood on your anger, it can turn black, and then it tends in the direction that we've described when describing the life of vice. But often enough, when you're slighted by somebody, when you're offended by somebody, that anger is meant to provide a kind of moral energy to say, hey, that wasn't good, right? That doesn't reflect well on our relationship. That doesn't hold me in mind and heart in the way that I ought to be held in mind and heart. And this obviously is most acute or keen when it comes to family and friends, people who really ought to have your best interest in mind and heart, but it can be generalized upon or it can be extended beyond the bounds of those relationships. But when you say to somebody, hey, not good, and you do so with a kind of vehemence or you do so with a kind of strength that helps the other person to recognize the way in which you've been dehumanized, the way in which you've been offended, or, like the way in which you've been transgressed against. And then it helps to motivate that person to redress the wrong, to take responsibility for the part that they played in it, and then to go about seeking your pardon and working towards forgiveness and an eventual reconciliation. So this registering of, okay, I've been offended, and this movement towards vindication is for the purpose of healing and growing the relationship, helping us as a human community to confront each other about the things which are not good, and then to lean back into those relationships, because then if we don't, right, the threat is that we'll just drift. Like it can be too difficult to confront this problem. And so I'll just gradually distance myself from the individual so that I don't get hurt by him or her, in future instances. But I'm just going to respond less promptly to communication. And I'm just going to invite to fewer engagements. And I'm just going to effectively despair of this relationship. But if we do that, to the right and to the left, or to the front, to the back, it's starting to sound like a dance move. If we do that, then we find ourselves alone in a kind of position of isolation and desolation, which is not where we want to be. So anger helps us to bring before the friend, the family member, the colleague, the acquaintance, the whomever, and say, like, I want to still live a life with you, right? Maybe I let my anger kind of run away at certain points, or maybe I let my anger get the best of me, and I need to do my best to rein that in. I need to do my best to discipline that. But I trust you with my anger in the sense that I want to heal whatever this wound is, and I want to grow together so that this relationship can be a feature in my life, so that it can continue to be important enough to build upon. And so in that disposition, then we seek those types of virtues, which we gestured to earlier. We seek those types of virtues to kind of work our anger into the place of a moral goodness, right? So on the one hand, there's the virtue of vindication, which is a virtue that's allied with justice, which seeks to rectify whatever injustice has been visited upon the relationship. So in that, there's a kind of hope that the injustice can be rectified. There's a kind of trust that whoever's responsible for it, right, will do what it takes in order to invest, in order to, bring it to the next stage. But then anger is also safeguarded, lest this vindication run amok or lest it kind of tend towards excess. Anger is safeguarded by meekness and clemency. Meekness moderates the movement of anger in the interior of our lives, and clemency moderates the movement of anger in the exterior of our lives, which is to say, it moderates the punishments that we mete out. So there are various kind of facets of our human life where we observe this twofold motion of one virtue which kind of impels us to seeking a good, and then another virtue which kind of softens it or reins it in lest it go towards a certain excess. So one way you can think about this is with respect to like magnanimity and humility. Magnanimity is this virtue which pushes us towards the doing of great things worthy of great honors precisely because they're great, because they reflect something of our human dignity and our human grandeur. But then magnanimity is safeguarded by humility, which says every good and perfect gift comes down to us from the Father of lights. What do you have that you have not received? If therefore you have received it, why do you boast as if it were your own? So humility communicates to us that this is all a gift from God, lest in magnanimity we start to claim it for our own as if it were exclusively our own. And I think we see a similar thing with those virtues which help to heal and grow anger, namely vindication, which says this is worth discussing, this is worth arguing over, this is worth leaning into. But then meekness and clemency, which says I can run amok, right? I can tend to excess. And so I need to soften this. I need to calm this. I need to be more recollected in my practice of this, lest I give way to my anger and fall into wrath and the moral ugliness which comes in its train. So I think that we shouldn't prejudge anger and say, wholly bad, can't possibly be salvaged, can't possibly be saved. We need to look to Christ, who exercised a certain anger, as it's described to us in the Gospels. We need to look to those saints who exercised a kind of anger, as it's described in their lives and in the tradition that's come down to us. And we need to have the trust that God, who has given this to us as part of our human nature, albeit at this stage a fallen human nature, can heal it and grow it in such a way that it's of service to our moral life and to the lives of others, those with whom we live, those with whom we work, those with whom we seek to do, the ministry of the Most High God. And in that spirit to cultivate the virtues which will see it through. And I recommend especially the virtues of vindication and of meekness and clemency. So that's my prayer for you. That's my prayer for myself. We can pray for each other along the way that anger would be in service of forgiveness, pardon, reconciliation, and communion, that we wouldn't give into it in crass ways, but we would seek to heal it and grow it so that it can find a home in God and in the Christian community. So thanks so much for listening to this installment of the Stand Firm Project. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you can learn what's coming out next and what's here for you and your spiritual growth.